there, James? Okay. My name is Shane. I am the pastor here at Wesley United Methodist Church. And we are so glad that you have chosen to join us tonight for this presentation. Before I served as pastor here in Yakima, I served for 5 years at United Methodist Church in Pullman. And one of the benefits was I was on campus on a regular basis going to things, and I got many opportunities to hear Dr. Matthew Sutton talk. And being from the Midwest, when you mix history and religion in an academic setting, I will eat it up. And so as in the spring, as I saw more and more conversations online with people, more and more people wondering about what is Christian nationalism, people not understanding that definition, how is religion being used in politics at this time, I thought I need to get Dr. Sutton here. And so we began scheduling this in the spring of last year, and we are so glad that tonight has happened and he is here. And so he's going to take a time to talk, and then we'll have a time for Q&A at the end. But I would encourage you to join me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Sutton.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you being here on a Thursday night. It's really fun for me to get out of town, off campus, and to talk to, not that my students aren't real people, but to talk to real people. And sometimes they tend to not care so much, and maybe they do care, but I suspect the fact that you're here means you're interested in this stuff. So this is great. So what I'm going to do is talk for a little bit about my research and how it relates to the 2024 election, and then we'll have some time, as Shane said, at the end for question and answer. And Shane, thank you so much for the kind welcome and for having me out. This is really great. I should say one other thing, that I don't know how this is the case, but I've been in the state of Washington since 2008 and have never been to Yakima. And just driving in, this place is gorgeous. So really, I'm so glad to be here for that reason as well. My older son played club soccer for many years. He's now, I'm ashamed to say, at UW, our horrible rival to WSU. But nevertheless, we traveled all over the state for soccer, and we always played Yakima, but we would play Yakima teams in tournaments, and so they were often in the Tri-Cities or on the west side. So I am glad to finally be in Yakima. Although I'm sorry I don't have time for Mexican food. I've heard you have the best Mexican food in the state. Yeah. So, yeah, and I grew up in Southern California, so I'm always looking for good Mexican food. So let me begin with a slide. If you could, James, hit the next slide. So this is something you may or may not have seen. But former President Donald Trump is selling his God Bless the USA Bible. And where is he pictured here in this image? Yeah, the Oval Office, right? So he wasn't actually selling the Bible when he was in the Oval Office, but he's begun selling the Bible in the last year or so, and he's chosen to sell it using a picture of himself in the Oval Office, right? And of course, that's intentional. That's on purpose. He is trying to make a connection between his role as president, as commander-in-chief, and the Bible he is selling. And James, if you can hit the next slide. And you can't read this at all. I can barely even read it from here. But there's a special edition, you can't read it, but I'll tell you what it says at the top. The Day God Intervened edition. And what it says, it's a commemorative edition. It's a limited print to remind people when he believes God saved him from an assassination attempt. The version below is a special autographed version for $1,000. So you can buy a Donald Trump autographed Bible. So my goal here tonight is to talk about and help us think about how we got here. What does it mean for a former president to sell Bibles in the midst of a campaign to reclaim the presidency? And really the larger question that I'm hoping to answer is, we know that his most faithful supporters in this election and in the 2020 election and in the 2016 election were white evangelicals. And they are the largest single religious group in the United States. So what I really would like to talk about is how did we get to this place where he has developed such devotion and such loyalty and such support from this group of American Christians? And what does that tell us about American history and American culture? So to do that, I'm going to give you a brief overview of kind of some of the questions I've been asking and I've been thinking about. And James, if you could hit the slide. Oh, thank you. You're already on top of it. Good job. So I got to grad school in 1999, went to UC Santa Barbara, and at that point, everybody thought the religious right was dead. Right? Bill Clinton had been in office for almost 8 years. Jerry Falwell had disbanded the Moral Majority in 1987. He had quit his job there. It just looked like this was a blip, that this was a kind of short-term phenomenon that was part of the Reagan era, and it was over with. Then, of course, 2000, George W. Bush is elected to the presidency. He made very clear his evangelical beliefs, his evangelical convictions, and suddenly historians started paying a little bit more attention again to religion and politics and thinking about the fact that maybe the religious right was not a short-term blip. Maybe there was something deeper there. And so that wasn't a major theme of my first book on Aimee Semple McPherson. How many of you have heard of Aimee Semple McPherson? Yeah, a bunch of you. Usually when I have an older audience, most people kind of have some vague idea who she was. But she was a really charismatic celebrity preacher in Los Angeles in the 20s and 30s. I was interested in a lot of things about her, but also about her politics. And then I realized my students who were growing up in the era of the culture wars had no sense of anything different, right? That was the world they grew up in, where there was debates over gay rights, over race and racism, over abortion. And so I put together this little textbook, Jerry Falwell and the Rise of the Religious Right, which is mostly a series of documents. Like students can read Phyllis Schlafly in her own words. They can read Pat Robertson in his own words, Jerry Falwell, Anita Bryant, lots of the folks who built the religious right. And so students can just read them for themselves and think about what these documents tell us about history and about race and about religion and about politics. Then 2014, I published American Apocalypse, which was a larger history of American evangelicalism and trying to understand who evangelicals were and how they came to occupy a central place in American life. And then I took a slight detour and in 2019 published Double Crossed. That was a book that was based on 4 characters. One second, we'll get to that one in a second. Was based on one of the characters I'd come across in American Apocalypse. What it focused on were missionaries who became spies during World War II. They worked for the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA. Because if you think about, if you're Americans going into World War II, you're building your first foreign intelligence agency ever. The US didn't have an international spy agency. You need people who know foreign languages, foreign cultures, foreign geographies. Who better to recruit than missionaries? And their stories had been classified until about the last 10 years. The National Archives finally released all this material, so I took advantage of that to tell this story. But since then, what I've been working on now, and James, you can hit the slide now, is a new book that'll be out in about a year. I don't know if this title will stick. I like the title, but my editor will have a strong say on that. But what I'm tentatively calling it right now is Chosen Land, How Christianity Made America and Americans Remade Christianity. And what it is the long history, really beginning with Columbus, of Christian activism in the United States, right and left, conservative and progressive, looking at lots of different groups and how they've influenced and shaped American history, because we are a nation that is more religious than most of our competitor nations, much more religious than Canada to our north, much more religious than England or than France or than Germany. And so what I'm trying to explain and also understand is why Americans are so religious and why that matters. And so that's what really we're going to talk about today to get us to the point where we can make sense of Donald Trump and this recent phenomenon in American politics. So basically, not basically, in fact, we'll talk briefly about colonial US history, then I'll talk about the 19th century, and then I'll talk about what has changed in the 20th and the 21st century to get us to today. If you hit the next slide. Okay, let's begin with colonial North America. When the first Europeans arrived, of course, this was an incredibly diverse place. Indigenous Americans had their own religious beliefs, their own practices, their own ideas, their own concepts of spirituality. So we need to kind of begin with that premise, that this was already very religiously diverse land. But the Europeans begin to arrive. And what do you know about American religious groups? Like, just shout out who you think of when you think of religion in colonial America. What groups? Separatists. Okay, so Puritans. Yeah, the Puritans were separatists. That's great. So Puritans were one of the first groups. One of the kind of things people talk about is they came here for religious freedom. But we need to qualify that. Was it religious freedom for everybody? No, it was religious freedom for them, right? They came here to worship how they wanted to worship and didn't feel like back in England they had been allowed, and they correctly, they were not allowed to worship how they wanted in England. So they came over to North America to establish, in their minds, a Christian utopia to be a model that the rest of the world would emulate. So that's one group here. Who else? Quakers, yes. Quakers were another group that came over. They settled first in New Jersey, what becomes New Jersey, also in Massachusetts, and then ultimately in Pennsylvania. William Penn was a Quaker. The king granted him a charter to establish a new colony where Quakers could practice their religion freely. Were they able to practice their religion freely in Boston with the Puritans? No, right? They were persecuted and in some cases actually executed for trying to make converts among the Puritans. So again, when we think of religious freedom, we need to recognize that the Puritans were building an experiment for them, not for competing groups like the Quakers. Who else was here in the colonial period? Catholics, yes. Catholics, very small numbers of Catholics. And they settled predominantly in which colony? Maryland, exactly. Man, you guys are good. You should be in my class. Yeah, so right, there's a reason it's called Maryland, Maryland. They too were given a charter from the king to establish a colony, but they intentionally kept a low profile. They recognized that they would be persecuted by the Protestants around them, and so they were very clear and very explicit as they were moving and establishing a colony in Maryland, and especially and also in Baltimore, that they needed to be careful not to offend the Protestant majority. That's most of the groups, but there are a couple others. Any others you know? Anglicans, yes, of course. Yes, that's a major one, right? Anglicans who are establishing colonies in Virginia and then spreading throughout the South. This is the official establishment church of the Church of England. Who else? Very small number of Jews. Yeah, they settled in New Amsterdam, which becomes New York. And then I heard somebody... Unitarians? Yeah, Unitarians come a little bit later, 19th century, well, late 18th century, 19th century. The Congregationalists are the Puritans. When the Puritans organized, they are called Congregationalists because of their church form. It's a congregational form. We're the local church. Methodists, yes, they come a little bit later too, around that time of the Revolution. The other group... Yeah, okay, but yeah, okay. And then the other group, the Baptists. Roger Williams, who breaks away from the Puritans, establishes Rhode Island. He's a Baptist, one of the first Baptists, and Baptists begin to spread throughout the seaboard. Okay, so all of the point here is that this is a very religiously diverse place as colonies, right? You have lots of different groups. And then, of course, the enslaved folks who came over, some of them came over as Muslims, some of them came over practicing traditional African religions, and then there was a small number that were actually also Christians that had been converted in Africa by missionaries and then came over. So the point being diverse, diverse, diverse. So that then takes you, we'll go to the next slide, it takes you to the American Revolution. And the challenge for the founders was how do you unify all of these people? What do you do to bring them together? Because you're not going to be able to have a single religious group. And so what they did was they settled for a generic kind of Protestantism. It was very much focused on God and on religion and on Christianity and on the Bible and on the person of Jesus, but it was non-denominational, it was non-sectarian, and that was intentional. So here's a painting. The painting was done in the 1840s, but it depicts the Continental Congress beginning their first session in 1774 in prayer. This is important for two reasons, I think. One is that they were trying to say what they were doing in forming a Continental Congress had divine sanction. That what they were doing was they were acting under the authority of God. And at that point, they weren't sure they were going to break away from England, but they were at least trying to say they needed to have their rights respected and that England was not respecting their rights. The other reason it's important is not because of what it depicts from 1774, but also from what it tells us about the 1840s when it was actually painted, which is that this was a moment of dramatic expansion of the United States. The Mexican-American War, this was well past the Louisiana Purchase. The U.S. was beginning to eye the Pacific Northwest. And so it was a moment to remind Americans of what they saw in the 1840s as their Christian origins, as their divine destiny. And so it's a source that kind of works in both ways. It tells us something about 1774, and it tells us something about the 1880s. But Americans believed that they had this kind of millennial destiny, that this was woven through the American Revolution. It was this idea that God had established them in North America for a very particular reason, essentially to establish his kingdom. And so they resurrected the old Puritan idea that they were on a divine mission, that they were creating a Christian nation for the rest of the world to emulate. Next slide. Okay, so that then takes us to how do you organize this new nation? They win the revolution. Oh, and I should also mention, sometimes I get ahead of my notes. So on the eve of the revolution, the Congregationalists or the Puritans represented about 20% of the American population, the white population. Presbyterians were about 18%. We forgot them earlier. They were strongest in the middle colonies. Anglicans were about 15%. They were strongest in the South. Baptists were about 15%. Quakers were about 10%. Catholics were about 2%. And yes, the Methodists were there, but they were down there in the 1 or 2% at that point. But they would explode, of course. They would explode. They become very important later on. Okay, so the founders have to deal with the question now of what do we do with religion in establishing this new nation. Articles of Confederation, the first governing document that brought the colonies together. There were 2 paragraphs in the first draft of the Articles. It was a confusing couple of paragraphs. It was contradictory. It didn't make a lot of sense. It was actually excised from the final draft. So the Articles said nothing about religion. They just decided to punt on the issue, that they weren't going to deal with the complicated nature of religion in this new nation. So then the Constitution, the founders have the same problem, right? How are they going to organize? How are they going to unify this very diverse group of mostly Christians, but also a small number of Jews, and then of course indigenous Americans, African spiritualities, but they weren't paying attention to the small number of Jews or African groups. They were thinking about the Protestant majority. And what they decided to do was almost entirely ignore religion. So the Constitution is an incredibly secular document for its time, and really even by today's standards. There's no reference to a deity, to divinity, to God. Hold on one second, we'll get to that in a second. No reference to God at all, which was extraordinarily exceptional for the 1780s or 1790s, right? You just wouldn't have found this in just about any other nation in the world. The one place the Constitution does deal with religion was actually in a negative clause. Now we can go forward, James, thanks. Which is Article 6, which says no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. So the idea here is it's saying that you can't discriminate on the basis of religion, that you can't prohibit somebody from holding federal office because of their religion. So it's vague, it's ambiguous, and it's the only thing the Constitution says about religion. But then we know that many of the states, the state legislatures, were leery of the Constitution. They were worried about ceding too much power to this new federal government. And so to get around that, the advocates of the Constitution promised that they would create a Bill of Rights, that they would establish a series of rights that they would build into the Constitution that the federal government would not be able to infringe upon. So these did not apply to the states initially. Initially, it was only about the federal government. And for our purposes tonight, of course, the famous one, the First Amendment, James, which says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This was a compromise amendment, that there were lots of different people who had lots of different ideas about what they wanted to protect and what they wanted to say in the Constitution. They all knew they could not have an established religion. There would be no establishment of religion because the country was just too diverse. You couldn't have Anglicans and Congregationalists and Presbyterians and Baptists and Quakers and figure out how to bring them all together under an establishment. And so what they decided to do was to say, we will have no establishment, but we will also not prohibit the free exercise of religion. And so the idea was that we wouldn't have Christians killing Christians because one was a Presbyterian and the other was a Congregationalist and the other was an Anglican. They looked at Europe and said, we don't want religious wars. And so this was a way they hoped to prevent religious wars. Now for some of the more liberal founders, they saw this as protecting all religions, protecting minority beliefs, protecting Jews and Muslims and agnostics. But for the majority of the founders, it didn't actually do that. They weren't saying we want to protect kind of these more marginal fringe religions. They just said we want to protect mainstream Protestants. We want to make sure mainstream Protestants aren't fighting with each other. And so it was vague, right? People saw in it what they wanted to see in it. Let me double check here where I am. At that point, there were state-level establishments in a bunch of states. So Massachusetts, Maryland, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Connecticut, and Vermont all had established churches, right? Taxpayer money could be used to fund established churches in those states. And those states either chose Congregationalist or Anglican. Those were the established religions in those states. Many of the state constitutions, 14 of them in fact, of the 14, 11 prohibited agnostics and Jews from holding political office, and 7 banned Catholics from holding office. And this was all believed to be constitutional, right? There was no qualms about having a state that says taxpayer dollars will support the Congregational Church and Jews cannot hold office in our state. Founders were fine with this. So the First Amendment did not apply to the states. Nevertheless, what do you do if you're trying to build a new country and you are a more democratic country than any country in the rest of the world? You are putting more power in the hands of regular people, in this case, property-holding white men, but still the people relative to anywhere else. And yet you don't have an established religion. This really scared a lot of the early founders. And so what they end up creating is an unofficial establishment, at least what I would call an unofficial establishment. And that is that the major Protestant churches got together to try to enforce their values and their beliefs and their ideals on the American people. And they did this through a series of ecumenical organizations. The American Tract Society, the American Bible Society, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, the American Home Missionary Society, a slew of temperance societies, Sabbath societies, right? So these were groups that were organized and led by Methodists, Baptists, Congregationalists, Anglicans, and that they agreed to work together because they believed it was essential to create Christian, Protestant, virtuous citizens if they were going to uphold democracy. The problem they had, though, the biggest challenge was what to do about slavery, what to do with the race question. And they mostly ignored it because they couldn't agree. And so there were anti-slavery societies as well, but there were also lots of theologians, religious leaders, ministers who defended slavery. And this was North and South. That for most Christian leaders, they just weren't that concerned about the slave issue until the 1830s and 1840s. And even then, the most radical abolitionists tended to fall outside the mainstream churches. Since I'm in a Methodist church, I'll tell you, Peter Cartwright, one of the early Methodist revivalists, by the 1830s, he's disgusted by his fellow Methodists because he believes that as they have moved up in terms of social class, they have become more complacent with the issue of slavery. And so it was an issue that would, as you probably all know, would end up tearing the major denominations all apart. And I'll come back and talk about that in a second. But there is this kind of development, this consensus that we are going to be a Christian nation, we're going to be a Protestant-dominated nation, but the states, it's okay if they're going to have establishment churches, and it's going to be okay to enforce Christian values on the rest of the nation, whether it's Sabbath laws, anti-gambling laws, temperance laws. Later it will be laws against profanity, public profanity, laws against letting agnostics speak publicly, letting people who are critical of the mainstream. Okay, next slide. But of course there are critics, right? There are Christian critics. There are critics from the inside. And so pictured on your left is Samson Occam. He was a Mohegan, indigenous American, who critiqued Christianity. He was a convert. He was a Christian, but he believed Christians needed to take race more seriously. And if you actually read his writings, it's incredible how forward-thinking he was. You could read his stuff today and think he had written it yesterday. I mean, it really is a biting, searing critique of race and racism in the established denominations. Jareno Lee, here in the middle, she worked with Richard Allen, the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME. She traveled the East Coast preaching revival, but also encouraging Christians to take race and slavery seriously and to bring an end to slavery. And then, of course, most famously, Frederick Douglass, who just constantly offered incisive criticisms of the mainstream churches for their lack of attention, not just to slavery, but to race and racism. He talked about how it wouldn't be enough to just overthrow slavery, that there was a deeper, more kind of corrupting problem that the churches were going to have to wrestle with. And so what they revealed was that while these white Protestant leaders were trying to create a Christian nation, there were always these critics who said, what does it mean to be a Christian nation, and Christian for who? That for them, they looked at the United States and said this was hell on earth. This was not a Christian kingdom. This was not their millennial dream. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the establishment, this unofficial establishment, lasts until about the Civil War. And then there's a new series of problems. The Civil War, of course, is the greatest of the problems. It splits the churches along, the issue of slavery. The Methodist split, the Presbyterian split, the Baptist split. This is why, you probably know this, but why you are the United Methodist Church today is because there was a reunification of the Methodists after the split into Southern Methodists over the Civil War. Southern Baptists have not reconciled, right? That's why we still have Southern Baptist denomination and then a lot of other different Baptist denominations. But that was one major challenge that splits the Protestant consensus. But there are others that come in the years after the Civil War. Another one is the rise of Darwin. And so, again, it's probably hard to see, but this is an early copy of The Origins of the Species, Charles Darwin's famous book laying out evolutionary theory. And the reason evolution was such a problem for the churches was not because they necessarily believed in a young Earth. The idea that the Earth was only 10,000 years old is actually a more recent development. 19th century Christians were fine with an old Earth. They were fine with huge geologic ages. The problem that Darwin posed was he said that humans were the result of survival of the fittest and basically random chance, genetic mutations, that they were not a specific creature made in the image of God, right? And so Christians believe that humans were distinct, that humans were not animals, that humans had souls. And so Darwin challenges and threatens that. For some Christians, it's okay. They can work with Darwin, and they can believe that God is overseeing the evolutionary process. But other Christians become very defensive and find this to be troubling, and they begin to wonder if there's a contradiction between science and faith. And so it forces them to kind of think about these issues and to deal with how are they going to reconcile them with their own theological beliefs. Another movement that arises is literary criticism. Scholars of literature begin applying their trade to the Bible. And what they realize is that the Bible was not this book that just drops out of heaven, but that in fact it was the product of multiple centuries of work, that it had been edited, that it had been changed, that we can see if we find older manuscripts how the language changes, or we can see that tradition attributed Moses to having written the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch. But it's clear that there are different authorial voices in those first 5 books. The book of Isaiah seems to have been written by 2 different authors, not the prophet Isaiah. And so again, what this does is it challenges established ideas about the nature of the scriptures, along with what Darwin had already done about the nature of science. But the biggest challenge was probably changing demographics. That the late 19th century was a high point in American immigration history, and many of those immigrants, a disproportionate number of those immigrants, were Catholics and Jews. And so they began to threaten Protestant power and Protestant supremacy. And so if you were in a late 19th century Methodist church, Baptist church, Presbyterian church, Congregationalist church, you're looking at all these changes around you, and you're thinking about how to adapt. And of course, this doesn't happen overnight. This is going to be over multiple generations. But the churches began to divide along ideological lines into 2 main groups, and you can hit the slide. Some of them focus on a social gospel. They say we're going to double down on building the kingdom of God in the United States and perhaps the rest of the world. We're going to focus on a practical gospel that people can apply to their daily lives, and we're not going to obsess over Darwin or over literary criticism, that ultimately what really matters is the person of Jesus, and if you keep your eyes on Jesus, everything else is going to be okay, that we're not going to be threatened by these new intellectual trends or by the fact that we have more Jewish and Catholic neighbors. But that's okay. Maybe we'll bring them into the church. And again, the idea was that Catholics were not Christians among most of these Protestant thinkers. Maybe you won't, but that's all right. But within those same churches, there is a return to an older theological tradition that had mostly vanished by this point, this apocalyptic tradition. For those of you who know your theology really well, it's called premillennialism. The idea is that we're not going to build the kingdom of God on earth. We're not going to establish his kingdom, but that instead what we're moving towards is what the book of Revelation talks about as the Battle of Armageddon, the great apocalypse, and that after this apocalypse, only then will we establish the kingdom of God on earth. So there's these competing theological streams in the mainstream churches. So people are worshiping the other side by side. It's not splitting churches at this point. But within those churches, you have Congregationalists and Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians who are embracing this apocalypticism, and you have Congregationalists and Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians who are embracing the social gospel. And of course, there are a lot of people in churches in Yakima, in Spokane, in Pullman, who are just living their daily lives and they don't care, right? This is just kind of high esoteric stuff that is not going to be what you're hearing about on an average Sunday morning. But this is what's going on in the seminaries and in the magazines and in the theological journals. Next slide. Okay, then we hit World War I. And World War I becomes a really decisive turning point for this theological divide because all of a sudden it becomes political. It has real-world implications in a way that it had not before. And the reason it has implications during World War I is that the social gospel folks, they're not happy about the war, but they sense an opportunity here to join with Woodrow Wilson, good Presbyterian, to make the world safe for democracy, as Woodrow Wilson said it, right? That's why he said the U.S. was going to fight this war, that this would be the war to end all wars. And so for the social gospelers, they think this is a good thing, right? That a little bit of evil may be done so that good may prevail. That perhaps God is using this war to refine humankind, to purify humans, and that ultimately the war is going to establish the United States at the top of the world order. The United States is the most Protestant nation, and so the United States will then be able to share the social gospel with the rest of the world. And so in 2014, when I published my Apocalypse book, I had a chapter title called Christian Nationalism to describe the liberals, the progressives during World War I. And this was before Christian nationalism became, the kind of term that it has become today. But nevertheless, it was the liberals, the progressives, who were the Christian nationalists who believed they could enforce their will on the United States and then on the rest of the world through the social gospel. The apocalypticists, those premillennialists, they were actually the skeptics of World War I, skeptics of what Wilson was trying to do, because they believed this is just one step on the road to Armageddon. And so they tended to be pacifists, tended to be the anti-nationalists. They were the ones who would not wave a flag in their churches. They were the ones who said, no. Our citizenship is in heaven, not on earth, and that God is just preparing us for the second coming. Next slide. After the war, the divide has really exploded because of the politics, because of this question of who is going to be the true loyal citizen, who is a good American. Are you a good American if you were the social gospeler? Are you a good American if you're the apocalypticist? And the apocalypticist folks decide we really need to come up with a name to distinguish ourselves. We need a way to define ourselves different from these social gospel millennialists. And so what they do is they focus on a series of books that had come out between 1910 and 1915 called The Fundamentals. This was a series of books put together by laymen who wanted to draw Christians back to what they saw as the essentials of the Christian faith, the fundamentals of the Christian gospel. And so what these apocalypticists say is we're going to call ourselves fundamentalists because we are going to do battle royale for the fundamentals of the gospel. And those were their words. And so it's out of this then that we have the rise of the fundamentalist movement, fundamentalist Christianity. And so the term gets applied pretty loosely today. You can talk about fundamentalist Islam or fundamentalist Jews, but it really was a term that Christians chose for themselves to describe what they were trying to do in the 1920s. And they were serious about doing battle royale for the Christian faith. And so they began splitting churches. They go to war against the progressives, against the social gospelers. And so there is the rise of a bunch of new denominations because they ultimately lose, right? They wanted to wrestle control of the Methodist churches, of the Presbyterian churches, of the major Baptist churches, of the Congregationalist churches, the Episcopalian churches, but they lose. They're mostly driven out of the major denominations, and they create their own independent fundamentalist congregations or their own new Baptist denominations, new Presbyterian denominations, new Methodist denominations that emphasize this kind of apocalyptic millennial move. Next slide. Okay, then we hit World War II. and everything goes topsy-turvy. Everything reverses. This is a fundamentalist magazine from 1939. You can see the date there. You probably can't see it. It's small print. But it's November 1939. So it's right after the Nazis have invaded Poland. The war has begun in Europe. And what these fundamentalists are showing is that the hands of history are pouring world events into the prophecies of Scripture. They believe World War II is setting the stage for Armageddon. But unlike during World War I, they become the nationalists. They become the strident patriots. Because what they do is they make a very small move theologically. They go back to the book of Revelation where Jesus says at the last judgment, he's going to separate the sheep from the goats. And if you read that in context, it looks like it's referring to nations. It's not referring to individuals. And so what they say is, yeah, we're moving towards the end times, we're moving towards Armageddon, but that rather than focusing on just individual salvation, we also need to focus on our national salvation, on being a godly nation, so that when Jesus returns in judgment, he will find the United States to be one of the holy, blessed nations. And so they become the kind of arch patriots during World War II. The progressive social gospels folks, meanwhile, they also have learned a lesson from World War I. And what they learned, or what they took away from the war, was that war is not going to be the salvation of the world. And so they actually, in the 1930s and early 1940s, tend to be the pacifists and the isolationists. They're the folks who are very skeptical of Franklin Roosevelt's crusade to make the world, you know, a more democratic, more free, tolerant place, because they're like, that's not going to happen. They think the way that we're going to have peace is through global ecumenical organizations, and so that becomes their focus. Next slide, please. So also during World War II, these fundamentalists recognize that they have a branding problem. And I don't have time to talk about it today, but they were kind of considered rural, uneducated, kind of country bumpkins. And so they resurrect a term that had mostly fallen out of use during the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, which was the term evangelical. It was an old term. It had been around since the Reformation. And this is Billy Graham here, if you don't recognize the young Billy Graham. But they resurrect the old term, and they begin calling themselves evangelicals at the moment that they form an organization called the National Association of Evangelicals. And it was a political lobby. It was put together by fundamentalist churches to lobby the government because they were concerned over two issues: that they wanted to have their people in the chaplaincy during the war. They wanted to make sure they had fundamentalists who were serving abroad. And they were also concerned about airtime on the radio, that the federal government, through the Federal Communications Commission, was cracking down on ministries' abilities to buy airtime, and so they wanted to be able to lobby. And so evangelicalism was born as a political lobby in the early 1940s as a direct result of the war. Next slide. Okay, one of the things I'm going to do in this lecture, which hopefully won't get too confusing, is what President Trump calls the weave. We'll see if I can pull it off more successfully than I think he does at times. But I'm going to talk about a few different issues and then tie them all back together. So we need to take a quick segue into what the Supreme Court is doing in 1947. And that is they're deciding a case, and it was a relatively obscure case over whether or not parents of Catholic children would be reimbursed if their children had to take public buses to get to Catholic school. Initially, the Supreme Court, the majority said, yes, we will reimburse parents for sending their kids to parochial school because we have a public interest in getting children to school safely, regardless of what schools they go to. So the draft majority opinion said, we will uphold the Everson family's argument that they need to be able to get reimbursed for sending their kids to school. But the minority draft at the time takes a different tact, and they go back to history. And they say, actually, we oppose the payment of these bus fares, these vouchers. And what they do is they invoke the words of Thomas Jefferson. They say Thomas Jefferson said, which he did say in 1802, that the First Amendment was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. And then what the court says is that it has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach. These were words that Thomas Jefferson used in a letter to a group of Baptists 13 years after the First Amendment was drafted and approved. So these are not the words of the First Amendment, right? The First Amendment doesn't say we're erecting a high wall between church and state, and in fact, it didn't do that. We know it didn't do that because there were establishment churches in many of the states. But the Supreme Court offers a new interpretation of the First Amendment, and this is where we begin to see what we often, and probably most of you think of, as the right interpretation of the First Amendment, which is establishing a high wall. But when we hear Christian nationalists today talk about the First Amendment was intended not to keep the government, not to keep churches out of government, but to keep the government out of churches, they're kind of right, right? I don't know, you can decide what you think it should do today, but what historically it did, it was intended not to build a high wall, right? That was not the majority opinion at the time of the founding. This was the opinion of the court beginning in 1947, carrying through until about 2014. Now it's up for grabs, and I'll talk about that again in a second. As I said, we'll weave back. But just keep in mind that the idea that the First Amendment establishes a strict wall of separation is out of the 1940s, not out of the 1780s or 1790s. Okay, next slide. Okay, so you've got this split now happening. The Protestant establishment is pretty much gone. The nation has become more diverse, more religiously diverse, and the major denominations have divided into fundamentalists or evangelicals and what we'll now call the mainline. Right, so today we would consider this church part of the mainline. The United Methodists are a mainline denomination. So these are the old established denominations that date back to the 19th century that used to really rule the nation in a lot of ways, all the way through the 1950s. Through the 1950s, evangelicals were out there, but they were kind of the pesky folks on the margins, on the sidelines. Billy Graham was popular, but part of what made him popular was that he was unique, that he was exceptional, that evangelicals had very little social and political power. But a series of events will rock the mainline denominations. One of them is civil rights. And you see Martin Luther King here giving a speech at the famous Riverside Church in Manhattan. Mainline church leaders in the 1960s, in the era of the civil rights movement, recognized that they had been too complicit in race and racism in Jim Crow. And so the leadership in the mainline denominations begin to want to atone for what they see as their sins. And so many of them get involved in civil rights. Many ministers, white ministers, are marching with Martin Luther King. Lots of denominations set up new committees to focus on civil rights and social justice. They start investing in ways to improve race relations. But in doing that, many of them, well, I'll come back and talk in a second. Evangelicals, meanwhile, they are reluctant to get involved in the civil rights movement. They practice and perform what they call the colorblind Christianity. They basically said, we won't see race, even though we know that's impossible. But what that does is it allows them to say, we're going to focus on converting individuals. We're going to change hearts. And only by changing hearts will we change actions, will we change lives, will we change racism. So they're not going to be explicitly racist. In fact, they would absolutely cringe that I would even suggest that they might be. But they believe that the solution is in changing hearts, not in changing laws, not in holding marches, and certainly not in civil disobedience. And so Billy Graham, for instance, tells Martin Luther King he needs to put the brakes on. He says, you're moving too hard, you're pushing too hard, you're moving too fast. We really need to focus on getting individual lives changed. So the churches have different approaches. The mainline and the evangelicals have different approaches to civil rights. Next slide. They also have different approaches to Vietnam. The mainline churches had been skeptical of the World War II. They were then skeptical in the early Cold War of military action and the value of military action and what military action could affect or accomplish. And then during Vietnam, they tend to be very critical of the Kennedy and then especially the Johnson administration and then of course the Nixon administration. And many mainline leaders join the anti-war protests, join the anti-war movement. They form a group called Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam, or CalCAV. And what I think is telling is that the leaders of CalCAV, and this was formed in '63, formed very early, before many of the other groups got really organized against Vietnam. What's telling, though, about the leaders of this group was they were all mainline Protestant clergy, but none of them had a local parish. Every single one of the leaders either taught in a seminary, they were a journalist or an editor of magazines like the Christian Century, or they were activists in other kinds of ways. All of them were urban-based, and all of them were Northern, with the exception of Martin Luther King, who of course was based in Atlanta. We can see here the Presbyterians during their national convention in 1971, they brought their pastors to Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C., and they decided, since we're in Washington, D.C., why don't we hold an anti-war march? And this was what the denominational leaders thought would be a genius plan. The pastors in the local congregations were furious. And so when I was doing research for this book in the Presbyterian Archives, I found card after card like this. And what it is it's asking the pastors basically to RSVP, are you going to participate in the Witness for Peace March? Did you have a reservation? Do you need a boxed lunch? If so, it's $1.50. But what the cards say, you probably can't read it, but at the top, this particular pastor has written, he's from Mississippi, he's written, I protest the so-called Witness for Peace made in the name of church in behalf of the radicals and the communists and against the government, our servicemen, and real peace. And then he said he's sending a copy of it to his congressman and to his senator. And so there's this growing disconnect happening between the Presbyterian leadership, and it's also happening among Baptist leadership and Methodist leadership, between what the denominational elites are doing and what's happening in the pews. Next slide. And then, of course, we also in the 1960s have to talk briefly, we won't talk much, but about the sexual revolution. People were having more sex than ever outside of marriage, and Americans were becoming more aware that people were having more sex than ever, that younger people were having sex, college students were having sex. And this had been building since the 1950s. But what school leaders decided to do, this is K through 12, but really high school, they began to focus more on sex education. They recognize if people are having sex, we need to at least make sure they understand how the body works. And this was not by any means, by today's standards, radical, but nevertheless, it was more of a focus on sex ed. Evangelicals get very upset about this. And you can see this tract that came out in the late 60s, is the schoolhouse the proper place to teach raw sex? Raw sex, yes. The implication here, of course, implication here being no, the schoolhouse is not the place to teach raw sex. But again, many mainline leaders wanted to have a role in developing the new sex ed curriculum, so they were working with teachers, they were working with principals, they were working with the main educational associations who were developing this new curriculum. And so, again, we see these kind of culture issues, but that they are splitting along denominational lines. Meanwhile, 1962, the Supreme Court decides Engel versus Vital, which was a case in which they threw out public prayer. The New York public schools had a mandatory daily prayer. It was very innocuous, very kind of generic. But the Supreme Court said, abiding by that 1947 decision, Everson decision, abiding by the idea that the First Amendment establishes a high wall, that we are not going to have prayers in the public schools. 1963, Supreme Court decides Abington School District versus Shemp, which requires the school, forbids public schools from having mandatory daily Bible reading. So the Bible is also removed from the public schools in the sense that you can't have teachers doing a mandatory morning, essentially a devotion, a Bible reading. So you've got sex coming in, and you've got God going out. This is at least the perception, right, among a lot of people in the 1960s. And the next slide. And then there's another case weaving its way through the Supreme Court, through the courts in the 70s that ultimately goes to the Supreme Court in the early 80s. And that's the Bob Jones University versus the United States. This was, Bob Jones University was a Christian college in South Carolina. It prohibited blacks from enrolling through the 1960s. It was outright segregationist. Then they began to admit blacks in the 1970s after Brown v. Board of Education, but they would not allow interracial dating. They said if you came to this school, you can't date across racial lines. Essentially, they didn't want black men dating white women in North Carolina or South Carolina. The IRS decided that race-based organizations were by definition not charitable, and so they went after the tax-exempt status of schools and other charitable institutions that practice segregation. And Bob Jones was one of those. And so Bob Jones sued and said, we demand that we are recognized as a tax-exempt Christian organization, because these are based on our sincerely held religious beliefs that God created the races differently, and you can't have amalgamation. You can't have interrace marriages. The Supreme Court ultimately disagrees. But why this is really important is because the National Association of Evangelicals is put on notice. They don't agree with Bob Jones. Most evangelicals disagree with Bob Jones. By the mid-70s, they're fine with interracial relationships for the most part. But what they see is that the federal government now has the power to overrule the sincerely held religious beliefs along racial lines. And so what is that going to do for gender and for gay rights? If a church, a Bible college, a seminary says we will not ordain women or we will not ordain gays or lesbians, is the federal government going to swoop in and pull their tax-exempt status? And this was the argument the lawyers made in an amicus brief on behalf of Bob Jones, the lawyers for the National Association of Evangelicals. They could recognize that the courts might become a problem for them. And so it's at that moment then that they begin focusing not just on these culture issues, but also on shifting the nature of the courts, because they realize that the Everson decision, that the idea that the First Amendment creates a high wall of separation is going to be a problem for them, because they are increasingly out of step with the majority of Americans on gender issues. And again, at this point, they're not out of step on gay rights, but they can see that they could be down the road. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm not going to talk much about abortion. Abortion was actually not that prominent of an issue for them in the 1970s. Evangelicals were fine with early term abortions at the point of Roe v. Wade. Mainline churches were mostly fine. They considered it a form of birth control. And also the Democratic and the Republican parties were also very diverse on the question of abortion, that there were pro-life and pro-choice folks in the GOP, pro-life, pro-choice folks in the Democratic Party. It's not until the late 1970s that abortion becomes politicized and that evangelicals make common cause with Catholics, and that's a whole other relatively complicated story, but it will become clear, or become important. Next slide. Okay, as a historian, I feel like I'm often in competition with sociologists, but I'm going to give a little credit to a sociologist. This guy, Jeffrey Hayden, wrote this book, published this book in 1969. He went out and surveyed mainline churches like the United Methodists. And what you can see is the subtitle here, The Widening Gap Between Clergy and Laymen. What he discovered in 1969 was that there was a growing problem in the mainline. And that is that on Vietnam, on civil rights, on feminism, that the clergy had gotten too far ahead of their congregations, that they had become too progressive, too liberal, and that they had left their congregations behind. That this wasn't a slow incremental thing where they worked together with their congregation to kind of move with the times, but that the seminarians, the denominational leaders, the journalists writing in the major magazines had all grown much more liberal. And I saw this in my research in the archives because there was letter after letter after letter to Presbyterian leaders, to Methodist leaders, to Baptist leaders on civil rights, on Vietnam, on women's rights, women's ordination, saying, we're going to leave the church, right? That you do not represent our values anymore. And so this becomes an opportunity for the evangelicals to draw these folks out of the main line. And in fact, that's what they do. And so, you know, I feel a little ashamed to provide these stats from a Methodist altar, or pulpit. But in the second half of the 20th century, the United Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Episcopalians all lost between 50 and 60% of their church members. So from basically 1950 to 2000. United Church of Christ, which were the old Congregationalists, lost about 80%. In the same time, the Southern Baptists grew by about 37%. And newer denominations like the Assemblies of God grew by 200%. And so there's a huge surge in evangelicals while the mainline essentially implodes. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's not just the politics and the culture war issues. Part of it is what's happening with children. Part of it's a lot of other issues. But there's a real dynamic change in American religion. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, evangelicals rediscover history. So this book was published in 1978 by two evangelical leaders. Peter Marshall was a minister. His father had been the chaplain of the Senate, also named Peter Marshall. What they write in this book was that our nation, actually, can you hit the next slide? I don't remember if I quoted or not. I did, good. That the nation was truly to be one nation under God. The reason that we Americans are in such trouble today is that we've forgotten God's design in shaping the United States. We've rejected it. We've become cynical about it. We as a people have thrown away our Christian heritage. And so in some ways they're right? They're looking back on the 19th century at this heyday of Protestant unofficial establishment. And they're saying, what happened to that? We want to return our nation to those days. And so this is 1978. They begin inserting this into the curriculum of Christian schools, of homeschoolers. At the time, it didn't have a big influence, but it would grow over time. And there would be successors to these guys. Most famously today, David Barton, who's been very active in the Trump campaign, has an entire huge curriculum of this kind of Christian nationalism history that will interpret the nation. And I should say, though, that it's not just that they are the accurate historians, because they ignore the voices of Drina Lee and Samson Occam and Frederick Douglass and kind of the dark side of what this Christian nationalism represented in the 19th century. Next slide. So at the same time that all of these things are happening, there are operatives in the Republican Party who are trying to push the party to the right. The party was pretty moderate in the era of Eisenhower and then Nixon. I know we think of Nixon in a lot of different ways, but Nixon's actual policies were pretty centrist. They were pretty moderate. And I can give you lots of examples, but I won't because we don't have time. But within the Republican Party, there was a very conservative faction that wanted to drive the party to the right. And what they did was they recognized that these evangelicals are gaining power, and that these evangelicals are not partisan at this point. Evangelicals tended to vote based on where they lived. So if they were a Southern evangelical, they almost always voted Democrat. They supported Jimmy Carter. If they were Northern or Western, they often voted Republican. But what they say, what these operatives say is, hey, if we can organize these evangelicals along political lines, we can bring them into the Republican Party, and we can drive the Republican Party to the right. And so they recruit people like Jerry Falwell, pictured here with Ronald Reagan. And he's game for this. He decides that this is a really good idea. And in return, what the Republican Party does is builds platforms around the core issues that are important to these evangelicals. And so beginning in 1980, and in every campaign through 2016, evangelical values and beliefs and ideas are at the center of the Republican Party platform. And so Republicans are masterful at recruiting this growing group of white Christians by making their values, by aligning their values together. And so the conservatives in the Republican Party who recruited them didn't care much about the culture war issues. They cared about economics, about taxes, about regulations. But they recognized that if they also talked about gay rights, women's rights, civil rights, that they could attract these folks to the party. And so that's what they do. And so the newly formed religious right helps put Ronald Reagan in office, helps put George W. Bush in office. And the Democrats are caught by surprise, They don't really recognize the sea change that's happening in American politics and how they've really missed the boat. And part of it is they didn't see what was happening demographically in the churches, and then they didn't understand how to organize the churches politically. Next slide. This is Ronald Reagan giving a speech before the National Association of Evangelicals. I mentioned this was the group by which we got the name Evangelicals, the contemporary version of evangelicalism. This is the speech in which he identifies the Soviet Union as the evil empire. So one of the key moments in his presidency happens before an audience of evangelicals. He sees them as central, at least in part, to what he's doing. Next slide. But there's one Democrat who gets it, well, there's more than one, but we'll just, for simplicity's sake, we'll say one who really gets it, and that's Barack Obama. More than most other Democrats, he understood what was happening, and he tried to make the Democratic Party more inclusive to people of faith. He said, we make a mistake when we fail to acknowledge the power of faith in people's lives. He said, we need to figure out a better way to reconcile faith with our modern pluralistic democracy. And then he quoted history. He said, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, William Jennings Bryan, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King, none of them would have had the influence they had without their dependence on the Christian faith. Then he said American law, and remember, he had been the editor of the Harvard Law Review. He said American law is, quote, by definition, a codification of morality grounded in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So he's saying, we need to understand the religious foundations of our nation, the religious foundations of our laws. During his presidency, he actually mentioned Jesus far more often than Bush. Bush knew he would take a lot of heat if he said the word Jesus or Jesus Christ, and so he was often kind of vague. Obama was never vague. He would say Jesus. When he was advocating for the Affordable Care Act, He said it was about Christianity, about doing what Jesus would want us to do. As many of you probably remember, he was against gay marriage during his first term. Joe Biden pushed him to support gay marriage. When he publicly decided to come out and support gay marriage, he and Michelle did an interview together to announce their shifting views. And what they said was that they had been rereading their New Testament, and they believed that Jesus told us to love our neighbor as ourselves, and the only way to do that would be to support gay marriage. So in making that policy shift, he grounded it in Jesus and in the New Testament. So he was also trying to insert Christianity into politics, just in a different way than George W. Bush had done before him. Next slide. So that takes us to 2016. Hillary Clinton running against Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton is what denomination? United Methodist, yes. I actually wrote an article that was published in the Seattle Times in 2016 saying Hillary needs to get Jesus. That was the title. And the argument was that she was, in fact, a good Methodist social gospeler. It had made her who she was, but she was reluctant to talk about it. And she might have taken a page out of Obama's playbook. She didn't. What do I know? I mean, I'm an academic in the ivory tower. But I felt like in 2016, she could have done a better job of broadcasting her Methodist identity, her Methodist roots, her faith in the social gospel. But nevertheless, Trump swoops in, takes power, and the question I was asking myself in 2016, and a lot of people asked me, was how can these evangelicals vote for this guy who seems so unlike them in terms of his character? And I heard a yes out there. But as I've thought about this for the last 8 years, I think it actually does make sense, because if you go back to the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and this kind of rise of evangelical politics, even though he himself is not one of them, what he's promising them is exactly what they had been asking for, a return to Christian America. And not just Christian America, but white Protestant America in a lot of ways. He talked about wanting to say Merry Christmas again instead of Happy Holidays to make Jesus front and center. He wanted to block Muslim immigration from the United States, kind of reverse the diversification and pluralization of the United States. He promised to support the socially conservative ideals of evangelicals. On foreign policy, he lined up much more closely with evangelicals than with the main line. We don't have time to talk about foreign policy tonight, in Israel especially, but those are also very important to this story. But what do we do about his character? In 2016, some of his Christian allies said he was a baby Christian, said he had converted, and we shouldn't judge him based on his older actions. He was born again, he was a new man. They don't say that today, right? I haven't heard anybody say that. Instead, the rationale and the argument is that Trump is the new Cyrus, the ancient Persian king whose story is told in the Old Testament, who helped bring the Hebrews back to Jerusalem from their exile. And so what they see is that he is not one of them, but he's the person God has chosen to bring them back from their exile, to restore them to the center of American life, to make them the center of American life and politics and culture. Next slide. So we can see that, actually you can't see him, but the stats just show that Trump has actually been more popular with evangelicals than Romney and then McCain. Like, he's incredibly popular with white evangelicals. And so I hope, in part, this long story explains why. Next slide. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip this, other than just to say, and evangelicals have gotten what they wanted in playing the long game with the courts, right? Trump has delivered to them. And we can talk here locally, the Bremerton case, Bremerton School District, Kennedy versus Bremerton, where the football coach is allowed, according to the Supreme Court, to hold prayers after football games as his capacity as a public school employee. Neil Gorsuch talked about how we've gone too far in establishing separation of church and state. We need the pendulum to swing back, which of course is what evangelicals noticed in the 70s during the Bob Jones case, and it took them 40, 50 years to succeed, but this is part of what Trump has done for them and why they're going to be very loyal to him in a few weeks. Last slide. So where do we go from here? I don't know. We have Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris. I saw just this week she was asked on one of the podcasts why she hasn't done more to talk about her life in the black church, and she got kind of defensive. She's like, I have talked about it. I think she could probably do better talking about it. She could do more. At the same time, Trump has been very clear that he is mostly interested in the support of evangelicals, but the way he's shifting on abortion, I'm finding very fascinating. The fact that he recognizes it's a losing issue for him politically, and so he's talking about leaving it to the states, vetoing a federal abortion ban, I think yesterday he said he was the father of in vitro fertilization. So the Republican platform, beginning in 2020, did not offer these kind of sops to the evangelicals. 2020 because they didn't do a platform. In 2024, there's not a lot of emphasis on the values that are important to evangelicals. Of course, they are central to Project 2025. So, if Trump is elected, we'll see what happens. But all of that to say, as a historian, I can't promise you what the future holds, but hopefully after this hour, and I thank you for your patience in sitting with me for an hour, you at least have a better understanding of how we got to where we are today. So thank you.
So we're going to take just a little bit of time for some Q&A. If you raise your hand, we are going to bring a microphone around. I don't care how loud you think you are, you're never loud enough. So please wait for a microphone, and we'll take some time and ask some questions of Matt here, and see what kind of rises up. I did want to start, and I don't know if you know this, the Everson case.
Yeah.
I looked up, it was while William Douglas was on the court. And I'm not sure, he's from here.
Oh, see, this is the problem of me not being a Washington native.
Yeah, William O. Douglas is from here. You can go to
our from Yakima,
yeah,
he's really from here.
Locally.
Okay.
You can go to our local museum and see his Supreme Court desk, and they have all of his writings.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know that.
I just thought that was interesting. But what questions do we have? I'm going to start over here.
I will make sure I point that out next time I'm in Yakima.
Hello. I just have a quick question because of their own history of how they view themselves as Americans. What does the LDS Church have to do with any of this? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I if we had endless time in the book, which is 700 pages at this point, I will answer that question in more detail. But one of the things that they're important is that they show us the limits of the free exercise clause in the 19th century, right? Free exercise didn't apply to them. They were not allowed to exercise their religion how they wanted to. They were chased from town to town, ultimately settled in Utah, but then they're not allowed to practice polygamy. So they are mostly marginal, mostly on the outside until the 1970s, and that's also the moment when evangelicals began making common cause with Catholics, who had really been their arch enemies throughout most of American history. But the relationship between Catholics, Mormons, and evangelicals is always a little bit tenuous. Even into the Romney campaign in 2012, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association had to scrub their website where they had called Mormonism a cult, because they were indirectly getting behind Romney and realized this was kind of embarrassing to say LDS Church is a cult if you're going to support Mitt Romney. So.
Good evening, and thank you for doing this. Interested in your opinion, being a student of history. My wife and I have talked often the last 3 years or so about similarities, what's going on in this country and in 1936 in Germany. Really frightening similarities, in my opinion, of making certain ethnic groups to be the enemies. 1936, it was the Jews, and this time we're hearing about all the immigrants that come into this country. Most of them that want to be Americans, want to achieve the American dream. So this is a very, very important election coming up. Probably one of the most important ones probably in my lifetime. So I was just curious on your opinion, if you see these similarities, what was happening post-World War I with Hitler and his talk, and now Donald Trump. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and my answer would depend on the day of the week and if I'm waking up in a good mood or a bad mood. That I do think there are some frightening similarities. I don't think we're to 1936 yet. Could we get there? I don't know. I hope and think that there are enough checks and balances on the power of the executive, that there are enough people who want to check kind of the nonsense that comes out of like the Haitian immigrants kind of stuff. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, some days I'm very pessimistic, and I would say, yeah, we're going the wrong direction. And as a historian and also as a professor in a public university, I really try not to share my politics. But you're asking me these leading questions, which in fact probably give away a little bit of my politics. At least you can probably guess who I'm voting for. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, we'll see, I guess.
I struggled with the things that Mr. Trump says and does, selling Bibles and even an autographed version. So do evangelicals put all that aside because he's put the people we want on the Supreme Court, he's done the things we want him to do, and we can overlook his language, and we can overlook what I believe are negative things about him. So is that what is happening?
Yeah, so I had the same question. In 2016, I thought there was no way he was going to have serious support from evangelicals. I thought they're just, if anything, they'd stay home. So I was stunned by, the 81% of white evangelicals that voted for him. And this book is trying to make sense of that. This talk is trying to make sense of that. And I still don't, this is the reason. The best I can come up with is that there is a sense, a persecution complex among evangelicals, that they have lost power, they've lost influence, and that Trump is a vehicle for restoring to them that power and that influence. But it's changed my thinking on how I see American evangelicals. When I wrote the Apocalypse book in 2014, I dealt with race and immigration and xenophobia, but I really thought those weren't central. And now I'm not so sure. Now I'm asking myself if maybe I gave some of those folks, the Jerry Falwells, who very vehemently opposed the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and I thought he was making the same argument as Barry Goldwater, a small government conservatism that just says we just don't want the federal government interfering in people's lives on any issue. And I thought, so maybe this was about this ideology and not just about blatant racism. Now I think no, maybe it was about blatant racism. So it's hard though, but yeah, scholars are still wrestling with this question. It's a good question.
I just wondered if you had a standard definition of what a Christian nationalist is, per se. And do people like the Proud Boys fall into that category?
Yeah.
Or?
So as far as I know, the Proud Boys don't have any explicit religious ideology, although they might. I haven't spent a lot of time with that. I actually generally don't use the term, and I don't find it threatening, because I think if you're a religious person, then you have the right to try to impose your values, through the ballot box. So, Martin Luther King is going to try to impose his values through the ballot box. The question is, whose values do we want and which values do we like? So it's not really about whether or not you're trying to impose your religion on society. I think it would be unfair to people of faith to ask them to check their religion at the door when they're thinking about law and culture. So, but basically the way Christian nationalism is used now, it's this idea that there's this group of people who are trying to force Christianity, their version of Christianity, on the rest of the nation. And they are, but like I said, I think Martin Luther King was too. I just liked his ideas better than theirs. So.
I wanted to just suggest that, or affirm that one of my favorite Shakespeare quotes, "The devil can cite scripture for his purpose." Yeah. If that isn't the exact words, it's pretty close. Do you work with any kind of functional analysis of people who present themselves as religious, but and maybe this is what you're saying in the title of the new book, they're dressing themselves up as religious, but what they're using the Bible to enforce norms that aren't derived from any spiritual, or well, they might be spiritual, but they're not related to any particular accepted religious doctrines?
Yeah, no, that's another good question. The Bible is so broad and so diverse and can be read so many ways that, you know, many of them will ground their arguments in the scripture, but other people will read the same passage and say that's not what it says at all. You know, do you emphasize taking care of the poor, or do you emphasize, you know, Second Amendment gun rights and claim that that's scriptural too, that you need to, you know, whatever, defend yourself? Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent. I guess the better way to answer the question is, among evangelicals, there is also a problem now because the term has become so closely associated with Trump that there are probably conversations like this happening in a lot of evangelical churches in the country where ministers are saying, you know, regardless of how you're going to vote, like, we want to focus on the Christian gospel and not get caught up in selling Bibles, sneakers, and culture war issues. And so it's created a crisis, I think, for evangelicals in the same way that the civil rights movement created a crisis for the mainline, because evangelicals are wrestling with how do they get people to focus back on why they think they're here, you know, on the cross, and not on the politics. So I don't know if that makes sense. I feel like I'm rambling, but
I'm still struggling with how to ask this question, but the J.D. Vance has been described as part of a post-liberal movement, lowercase l, or even anti-democratic movement. You were talking about people asking for support at the ballot box for their religious beliefs. Is there an antecedent to this post-liberal, or anti-democratic that's within the church? And how does that work historically? Thank you.
Yeah, so I've toyed with writing an op-ed about this because that's a great question, and I should go back to this. So in the late 19th, early 20th century, the early fundamentalists, or really the proto-fundamentalists, they thought democracy was a sham. They believed it was just a step in the rise of the Antichrist, because if you are inherently corrupt, if original sin is in all of us, then really why would we empower ourselves to be the ones making the choice? That you would want the most righteous leader, the king, King David, to help make your decisions for you. And so there is this anti-democratic tradition. It disappears around World War II for the reasons you asked with Hitler and the fact that evangelicals jump onto the national bandwagon. And so then that rhetoric kind of dies. But yes, it's coming back now with J.D. Vance and some of these folks who are now saying, you know, maybe democracy isn't what we need. Maybe we shouldn't trust the people.
During this week, I had to fly out of town, and coming back, flying through SeaTac, a lot of time to kill. So whenever that happens, I try to act literate and go to Hudson's. Passing by the magazine counter, I saw this magazine with big letters, bigger than the magazine name, God, Religious Nationalism. Brother Jones magazine, hadn't seen that in years. Picked it up, and one of the articles stressed how this religious nationalism movement is being moved into small towns across the country.
Yeah, and you know, I live in Pullman, 7 miles from Moscow, Idaho, which is one of the kind of centers of this movement with Christ Church, Doug Wilson, New St. Andrews College. So I've been watching it, you know, because of my own interest. As soon as I moved to Pullman in 2008, I was very curious about what was happening, and it's been supercharged in the Trump era. So there is a shift that has happened in I see, like I said, in the town of Moscow. It is very much driven by what Trump has done through social media and through his persona, and he has emboldened some folks to, which gets back to your question, to kind of run roughshod over the idea of democratic consensus building, and instead to work to acquire power for the sake of imposing your power on others. So that, yeah, I mean, it's happening, and it's been happening through the guise of some churches.
Chuck Lee here at Washington State, they made me stand up whenever I ask questions. We're focusing on the Christian nationalism because it has such an effect on us internally on our issues. But do you have a sense on how, with the background of exceptionalism, where this national
Yeah. The Ukraine thing is another thing that baffles me in the sense that I don't know why this is, I don't know how people like Tucker Carlson and J.D. Vance have convinced evangelicals to side with Putin, other than that Putin has been smart at using the Bible to try to, the Russian Orthodox Church, but a form of Christianity, to try to say, we're going to stop the gays and lesbians, we're going to stop the Muslims, we're going to kind of stop the threats. And so they've embraced that part of Putin while ignoring so much else about Putin. But I still find it strange that they don't see through what Putin is doing, but also, yeah. The Middle East issue is more complicated in all kinds of ways because of that particular history. Evangelicals will certainly side with Israel, and that dates back, and this is the part I couldn't talk about, but this dates back to the folks who become fundamentalists, who become evangelicals, were also some of the first Zionists in the United States. They led the charge. A lot of American Jews in the 1880s and 1890s were not Zionists. They thought this was the promised land. They were happy to be in the United States. There was far more freedom here and much more opportunity than you would have had in late 19th century Palestine. It was the evangelicals who believed in biblical prophecy that Jews need to return to their homeland. And for that reason, they're going to be staunch Zionists to the end, I think. I mean, I can't predict the future, but I don't see any reason why they would compromise on that at all. And in fact, they were very critical of George W. Bush when he wanted to recognize a Palestinian state, when he talked about a partition and a separation, because they felt like Jews were entitled to the original Holy Land, which included more of Palestine.
You mentioned Doug Wilson and the Christ Church, and we are seeing Christ Church, them taking over politics, like the school board, city council, businesses.
Here in Yakima?
No, in Moscow.
In Moscow, yeah.
Moscow, you're seeing that.
Yeah.
But we are seeing, I think, the evangelical religious right saying we need to start at school boards, we need to start in city councils. How do we see that playing up more to then affect the national races? Yeah,
so and Ralph Reed actually developed this political philosophy in the early 90s when he launched the Christian Coalition with Pat Robertson after Pat Robertson's failed presidential campaign in 1988 or 92. Oh my gosh, must be 88. And so what he said is that we're not going to go for the presidency. He's like, that's a failed philosophy. He actually said, we're going to be like ninjas. We're going to hit you at night. You're never going to see us coming. And we're going to start with the school boards. And Ralph Reed ultimately later today is another advisor for Donald Trump. But he was one of the architects of the religious right kind of after Jerry Falwell. And so they knew they were playing the long game. And I think we see this most clearly in the courts with training up students, right, building their own law schools. Pat Robertson's Regent University in Virginia Beach has a law school where they wanted to compete in schools like Jerry Falwell's Liberty University. They wanted to be the BYU of evangelicalism. Baylor University, Southern Baptist School, Southern Baptist. It's Baptist, I can't remember if it's Southern, or I'm pretty sure it's Southern Baptist. It's what? It's Baptist, I just can't remember if it's Southern Baptist. Okay, thank you. But so there's this idea that you start by training children who can compete, who can then get into top tier law schools, get into politics, and yeah, it becomes a ground up kind of thing that starts with school boards, starts with law firms, and moves from there.
Well, you brought us. You brought us to this point, and it seems like as history has gone along and groups have competed against groups, it's just very, very obvious that power and greed, just corrupts. It doesn't make any difference. Power and greed. That's where we are.
Yeah. Take that back to the sin nature. Yeah.
And we'll take, I think, about 3 or 4 more questions, and then.
Hi, I just wanted to know, based on what you said, it's learned a lot. Do you have a country then you would say we should try to emulate and see like what steps they took to get there?
No, that's a good question. I haven't thought about that. When I think of other countries, I think of the best beaches, not the political system. And I spent 2012, 2013 as a Fulbright scholar in Ireland, which was when Obama was running for re-election. And I spent 2015, 2016 in Germany, in Heidelberg, as a visiting professor. And what I found about being in other countries was how nice it was to not worry about American politics and to realize they had their own problems and they were different problems, but they were still problems. But yeah, I don't know that there's an ideal model. So it's a good question. I'll have to think about it.
I've been thinking for some time that the core and the basis of our white Christian nationalism really has roots that go back centuries into, I go back to Constantine, when the church became part of power. And it became a part of Western European, and then it came across in all different forms in terms of race, in terms of conflict and tension. And so it's, if I'm correct on that, it's embedded in us in a sense that we may not even recognize what we're doing, and we're still wrestling with it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As an undergraduate, I had a Mennonite professor who made that very argument and introduced me to Constantine and so if you don't know, Constantine converted to Christianity in the 4th century and created the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and began persecuting non-Christians. And so that kind of set the idea of Christians moving from marginal people on the outskirts who were being persecuted all over to the people who became the persecutors. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Thank you. Other than cast my vote, what do I do? I feel helpless.
I think that's a question for a pastor, probably more than a professor.
I think what you did, I liked your understanding, like Christian national, because if you believe in your faith, you should take your faith to the ballot box. Now, part of the struggle is our democracy, it's a two-party system. There's not a lot of options.
Yeah.
And that's a whole nother debate for a whole nother time.
Yeah.
But I do think what your talk does is it helps us see these threads. And, maybe we'll have to bring them back again some other time, because I've also heard you talk, and you mentioned the Zionism and how that affects. Like, there's, I think, historically, all of these threads present, where I think you could argue we're just in another cyclical motion of history. And that what we're going through is not unique.
Yeah, I love everything you just said, but I will go back to your question in the 1936 and the Nazis. I don't think we're not Nazi Germany, but I do think there is something different, and I will agree that this election is probably pretty important, probably more important than a lot of recent elections for a lot of reasons. And so yeah, on the one hand, there's cycles. I try not to get too obsessed with what's going to happen down the road and worry too much. But I've got kids, and this is going to matter for the world that they grow up in, and I worry about that.
Well, I think that's a great final comment. I would say, something we're doing right now at Wesley, we started just this past Sunday what's called the Kindness Campaign. It's with thousands of churches in the U.S. I think as Christians, but also you see it in strands of other religions, do unto others this election cycle. And so I think that's important. Would you join me in thanking Dr. Sutton? I found your new book. Is it more academic based or for the common reader?
For the common reader.
Okay.
Yep.
700 pages doesn't seem like for the common reader.
But one of those big books to pretend you've read.
Yes. But yeah, thank you for coming. We have some refreshments out in the narthex if you'd like, and take some time to talk. And this is something that's important to us. I will tell you, I counted 78 people here, and I looked, 30 people were joining us online. So over 100 people, and I think how many of us probably thought, I might be the only person in Yakima here at this event. So I think that speaks to wanting to learn these things and learning the historical elements of these. And so we'll continue to have conversations to do these things in the future. So thank you for coming and joining us.